Hello, welcome to Microsoft Excel, Level 3, Video 1, Introduction to VLOOKUP. So in today's video, what I'm going to work on with you is understanding a new function. And the one we're going to look at today is called VLOOKUP. Now, it is, again, like the if statement, a rather commonly used function. And where VLOOKUP benefits over the if statement is in the options that are available. So in an if statement, if you remember from the previous videos, other than a nested one, which is complicated, the if statement is really just a true or a false style of response. A VLOOKUP is different. So if we look at the example that I have up on the screen right now, I have a cell to be verified, which in this case is number 30. And I have the VLOOKUP statement with the answer in this cell over here, which is blue. And then there's this piece over here called chart. So a quick look. What does a VLOOKUP do? It takes a cell and looks it up in a chart. And our chart is over here. And the chart, in this case, contains a handful of options so that we see some numbers along this column. And the column beside it is the corresponding color. So number 30 follows in blue. So the chart has got a bit of idiosyncrasies to it, so we'll get to that in a few minutes. The nice thing is here, the chart can be as large as you want it to be. Now I have just a handful of options for simplicity, but it can be 50, 100, 1,000. The chart could be as large as you want it to be. There's also options for other complexities in the charts. We're not going to get too elaborate with those, but when we do get to the last video there, you'll see where it can kind of build past the basics. So how does it look? Well, I'm going to click on the word blue over here, just so that you can see a VLOOKUP example. So just like in our if statement videos, there are a couple of files for you to download and either print out or reference along the way. I will talk a bit about those shortly, but here it is. Equals VLOOKUP, open bracket. So A5 is the cell that we want to reference. So in this case, it's blue, matches the blue in here. Then there's a comma that separates out the location for our chart. So our chart is cell F9, G14. So it's in peach kind of salmon color, and you can see the same thing over here. It's now color coordinated to where the chart is. That chart location is then separated by a comma, and number 2 references to display the second column of data that's available here, and a close bracket at the end. What else is there that I didn't mention is 4 dollar signs. So that's going to be one of the sheets that you are to download, the PDF sheets, is absolute versus relative cell reference. So the cell reference sheet explains what these are. And I'm going to flip over and talk about that one right away. But that's what a VLOOKUP is. So the F9, so if we just ignore dollar signs for a second, F9 is the first cell in the first column of your table. Then there's a colon, and then it's G14. Well, G14 is the last cell in the last column of your table. Okay, so when we talk about chart reference in this orange salmon color part that's over here, F9 is the first cell, G14 is the last cell. So that's helping the VLOOKUP understand where the location is. Okay, so let's head over and just talk a little bit about some of those feature sheets that I gave you. So the first one here is called relative cell reference, and this is the dollar signs that I mentioned a minute ago. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. We're going to make some mistakes. We're going to play a little bit with it so you understand why we use these dollar signs and what the purpose is. So when we talk about referencing our cells or the location of a cell of data in Excel, there are 2 types of cell references. Relative cell reference is what we've been using all along to this point. So the cell that's being referenced is relative to where we slide or drag our mouse. So earlier in level 1, we talked about using the black cross in the bottom right-hand corner of a cell to drag down or drag across to autofill and complete equations. So for example, remember in, we did a personal finance where we talked about, you know, bill payments for MTS bill and your hydro bill and your food bill and Visa and so on. All we had to do is auto sum the first column, and then we could drag fill that across, and it would automatically add up everything else. Because when we drag and slide, the cells move relative to where the mouse is. So A1 becomes B1, becomes C1, D1, and so on. That's what we've been using all the way up until this point. Now, if you remember in our if statement videos, I mentioned don't use dollar signs inside of here. So people will use dollar signs in if statements thinking that they're talking about currency. It is not currency. The dollar sign is what makes the cells lock down for absolute cell reference. So when we use a dollar sign before the column letter and a dollar sign before the row number, you have to have two dollar signs in there. When we then try to drag and pull that formula along, it doesn't change. So even though we move to column B, C, D, E, it still stays at A1, 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 all the way along. Now, as a beginning user, that might seem really strange. Why would we want to do that? Shouldn't we want it to automatically flow and change with us? And a lot of times that answer is yes, we do want it to change. However, there are times where maybe that cell A1 contains, for example, minimum wage, and you're doing a timesheet for all your employees in terms of how much money they earn this week hourly. Well, if I'm referencing back to cell A1 that contains minimum wage, I don't want it to slide off of that and become B1 because there's no data in that one. So there are actually a lot of times where you want to lock a cell down, not just in a VLOOKUP, which we're going to be learning about in these series of videos, but in other examples as well. So as you become more proficient in Excel and as you move through multiple spreadsheets in your work world, you'll see that suddenly there's these dollar signs inside of equations. And the purpose of that is to lock them down. So this sheet that gives you a quick little definition of the difference between absolute and a relative cell reference is really important. These are ones that you're going to run into quite regularly. So until you become comfortable with it, make sure you hang on to that sheet. So the fundamentals of the VLOOKUP statement, I gave you this sheet as well inside of your files to download for the video sequence. And much like we did with the if statement, here's a quick breakdown of what a VLOOKUP is. Now, notice here in this sheet, if you have it open right now, the dollar signs are not there yet. So as I'm creating the spreadsheet for a VLOOKUP, it doesn't automatically put them in. So when we use our mouse drag method and things that I'll show you shortly, you'll notice that as well, is that you do have to go back and put the dollar signs in after you create the function, like all the components inside the function. So sometimes just to help people see it clearer, it's better sometimes not to put the dollar signs in for the example. In a real one, you must put them in though. So here's what we have. Equals VLOOKUP, right? Our function name, that never changes. There's no spaces, any of that stuff as usual. Open bracket, well, A1 is the cell that you want to check. There will never be dollar signs around A1 because that's the one that's going to flow and change and transition as we move along. So A1 could become A2, A3, A4, A5, or it could be A1 becomes B1, C1, D1, E1. It depends on your sheet. It really doesn't matter. Next, we separate the cell to be checked or referenced by a comma. Now, this is the same as it was in the if statements. We separate components within any of these functions with commas. So A1, comma, and then C5 colon D11. That is the location and the size of the table. Now, I can't emphasize this enough. The C5 refers to the first cell of the first column of the table. Don't grab the label, just the data side. So C5, then a colon, and then D10 is the last cell of the last column of your table. Now, in the more complex VLOOKUPs that I've seen, they've even had 3 columns of data in their tables. So it can get a lot larger than just simply, 2 rows of 5 or whatnot. So be conscientious that it's the first cell of the first row and the last cell of the last row. And this tells the VLOOKUP function where to look in between to find the answers to report back on that cell to check. The table location is separated by a comma and a 2 at the end. And the 2 just tells us to find and report the answer back from the second column. Now, this is a simple VLOOKUP. Much like the if statement, there's more complex versions of VLOOKUPs out there. I'll touch on a little bit of this in our last video, but I don't want to get too confusing yet because there's a lot of extra parts that you can build on from here. Remember, we're looking at just the basic functions and the ones that you're going to encounter more commonly. Okay. Obviously, at the very end here, we would add in our dollar signs. So let's go practice that a bit. I'm going to get out of there And I'm going to head back over here to our example page. So VLOOKUP I have here, and I'm going to now just escape out of there, and I'm going to click once on here, and I'm going to delete that out. And we're going to practice a couple of times making this one. Now, I want to talk a bit more about the chart before I go and build it in, because the number that displays over here that we're going to play with a little bit later, if, for example, it was 12 instead of a whole number that just lines up perfectly on our chart, how does it know then where 12 goes and how this all works? So here's the explanation. Anything between 0 and 9 is green. 10 to 19 is red. 20 to 29 is orange. 30 to 39 is blue. 40 to 49 is white. 50 all the way up to infinity would then be black. So it's not just the numbers that represent the color in our example here, it's the range of numbers in between. So that's usually the first part that kind of trips students up. I chose this chart just with a number and a color just to keep it simple, because if there was a number in both columns, this is what kind of confuses people at first. So remember, we're not just looking at the whole number that's here, for example, 10, red. It's actually from 10 until 19. The gap in between also counts as what would go into red. So 12, for example, should report back as red. So let's go ahead and make that VLOOKUP statement together. If you want now, you can pause the video and create this sheet for yourself. If you're going to do that along with me at this point, be very, very careful. Make sure everything is in the exact same cells that I have chosen as well. So my data piece is in A5, and then my chart here, of course, is F9 to G14. So be very sure you have to be in the exact same cells. So go ahead and pause the video now, and you can create this piece. Okay, welcome back. Off we go to make our first VLOOKUP. I'm going to click over here. And by the way, there actually is an H lookup as well, a horizontal lookup. That is for sideways-based tables. Pretty rare to see those. Most of the time, people prefer the vertical one. So the VLOOKUP is obviously the one that's more commonly used. So here we go. I'm going to press the equal sign, and we're going to type in our name, VLOOKUP. Shift and 9 to open a bracket. And you can see here that the helper part pops up again. Lookup value, table array, column index number, range lookup. That's the more complex side of things with the VLOOKUP that I mentioned that we're going to not touch on just yet. So here we go. The first piece that we need after we have our open bracket is the cell that we want to check. So in this case, it's A5, where my data is. So I'm going to give that a click. Go ahead. We separate our cell to be checked by a comma. So press the comma key. The next piece is to select our chart. Now, for simplicity's sake, with even our if statements and things, we've never really looked at flipping between pages or even between books. It doesn't always have to be right here. And VLOOKUP is one of those ones that are a lot more common to see the chart of data somewhere completely else. Out of the way, right? That's the idea. Out of the way also means that you don't have a chance of accidentally clicking and changing the data chart, or accidentally typing over top or expanding into it and causing problems. And it also doesn't get in the way. For us, for simplicity's sake, I'm always going to have the chart close by. But be aware, your chart could be on a different page. It could be in a different Excel workbook completely. That is fine, and it's actually more common than not. So when we're in class together, a lot of these classes are where students would ask about that, saying they're having trouble with their VLOOKUP at work. And what I shared with them was, well, find the chart as part of the piece to begin with. And the ways that you can locate your chart, of course, is by pressing your Control and your accent key, remember that from earlier videos, to pop open and take a look at your function and see exactly where is it pointing to for that chart. Because if it is a different page, it'll reference that in there. If it's a different workbook, it'll give you a clue as to where to go. Some of our bonus videos, we're going to talk about some of those troubleshooting tactics as well. So here we go. We now need to type in the location of our table. I don't like to manually type it in. I prefer to let the mouse do the work for me. So I'm going to take my mouse with the white cross, and I'm going to put it over the first part of the first column of the first piece of my chart, not the word chart, not the title. Remember, only the data. So with the white cross on the 0, I'm going to hold the mouse button down, the left button. I'm going to pull across to the right once, and then down, 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 down to highlight the entire chart. Let go, and make sure now, again, I'm looking at color sequencing. Blue to blue for my cell to be checked, orangey peach color for the chart location, and very critically, are the marching ants, the outside lining, is it cover the entire data for the chart? Be very careful, make sure it does that. Okay, everything looks great, so we're going to go comma again after that, and I'm going to press number 2, and then I'm going to go shift and close the bracket. And our VLOOKUP is nearly completed. The piece that's missing is we need to have the dollar signs in there to lock this down as absolute cell reference. Right now, everything is relative. So A5 is relative to the cell that we're in right now. F9 colon G14 is relative to where we are. So you stay where you are. Don't do what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to show you what happens if you forget the dollar signs. Okay, so I'm going to press enter. And I'm just going to give a couple more numbers down here. We're going to go 5, enter, and we're going to go 34, enter, and we're going to go, I don't know, maybe 42, enter. The numbers really are insignificant. So this would be a little bit more realistic. We have our VLOOKUP created here, although I made a mistake, right? So you wait and watch what happens when you screw up. And then we have a few more numbers. Our last step always was to drag the formula down. I'm going to quickly drag down and show you what happens. As I pull this down and let go, oh, wait a minute, I got an NA. What happened here? These ones work, but I got an error. Did I type something wrong? Well, it's not that you typed something wrong. It's that we did not put in the dollar signs to lock down our chart location. Okay, so look, if I go down to the last one here, for example, I double click on white, look where my box is over here. We've half slid off of the chart location. So this is what happens if you do not use the dollar signs. We want the first letter, so A5 to slide to A6 to A7 to A8, but we do not want our chart to slide down. So what started with F9 has now become F12 as we've flowed or completed the drag down along the side. So to prevent that from sliding, we have to lock those cells down. So I'm going to delete this and go right back to where I told you to wait for me, which is right here. Here's where we are. The next step in the process is we must put our dollar signs in to lock down the chart. This is the most common location for errors when it comes to a VLOOKUP that people make. So we need 4 dollar signs before every column letter, and before every row number, we need a dollar sign. So at first, this is awkward. At first, this is a bit confusing. So this is why I'm going to leave you today to practice these pieces over and over again before we get into each of the specific scenario activities. So here we go. I'm going to click just before the letter F of my table. Now, take a look really closely here. Check this out. We are on one side of F, but the comma still needs to be on the A5 side. Don't forget that. A lot of times students accidentally get the comma on the wrong side. So this is where the mistakes always happen. Just before the letter F, we're going to go shift and number 4 to get a dollar sign. Then where the number 9 is, I'm going to carefully click between F and 9 to get my flashing cursor there. Shift and dollar sign. So now I've got dollar sign F, dollar sign 9. So that's going to lock down my F column, or the beginning part of our F column, sorry, where the chart is. We then need to lock down the back side as well, so the G14. So click just before the G, but make sure you don't get on the wrong side of the colon. Shift and number 4, click on the 14. Shift and number 4, and now we have our dollar signs correctly. Okay, so the full VLOOKUP is equals VLOOKUP, open bracket, A5, comma, dollar sign F, dollar sign 9, colon, dollar sign G, dollar sign 14, comma 2. Okay, I'll pause for a minute here, make sure that you have this correctly typed in. And what we're doing is we're locking this chart down. this box will now not slide or not fill down when we drag down to the other numbers that are there. Okay, go ahead and press enter. The answer should be red because 12 falls between 10 and 20. So that worked. If you got an error, pause the video, back up a few seconds and pause it over top of the equation and just confirm that you have it typed correctly. If it gets an error, odds are high, you just mix something up a little bit and usually it's in those dollar signs. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to click once on the word red. Now I added some more numbers in here. You can go ahead and do this also. And I'm going to find my small black cross, solid black cross, hold my left button down and pull, 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 and let go. And everything now works correctly. So if I take a closer look at the last one, for example, yeah, A8, but the chart is still exactly where it's supposed to be. So there's your difference between absolute and relative cell reference. We're going to stop video 1 at this point. What I want you to do is practice several times with this. So you can go ahead and delete out these pieces out of here. You can delete the numbers and come up with some new numbers if you want, and recreate the VLOOKUP several times until you become comfortable with it. Our plan in our next videos, we're going to be looking at a hospital scenario where you're recording patients' blood pressures. We'll show you an example of how we can, well, just as we had here, respond back as labels. We're then going to do a shipping company. So you work for a company who is shipping products, mail order, you have to pay for shipping costs, kind of like Amazon, I guess, right? So coordinating a chart that would provide shipping fees and things based on a total value. These are all great world-based scenarios. Then we're going to hit a gradebook project one, and our gradebook one is going back and looking at the example very similar to what we did with the if statements. And if you remember when we did a gradebook one there with the nested if statements, I said, don't worry too much about this because there's a much simpler way to do it. And using a VLOOKUP for a gradebook is much easier than a nested if statement. I'll talk a little bit about that true false piece that's at the end. And this is where we're getting to more advanced if statements, VLOOKUP statements where we have an option at the end for an absolute response or not. And then I'm going to leave you with a fun activity at the end that's going to combine together some of the pieces that we've looked at in all of our videos throughout levels 1, 2, and 3. Okay, thanks for watching.